Each testimony builds a stronger case. Every sharp focus reveals clarity. Learning your legal rights, upholding unyielding justice.
Coming from today?
Tucson. I was meeting a client there.
Just you in the car?
Yes, sir.
Why is that? Folks usually got passengers. You ain't got family with you?
I'm on a business appointment, alone.
And you're a citizen? You got proof? You talk real smooth for a guy not telling me
I'm
much.
a United States citizen. My passport and license are in my wallet.
Let's see about that.
Border Patrol agent Craig Sutton was known at his station for being aggressive with people he personally deemed worth watching. When he spotted a black man traveling alone with nothing but a bag and a calm expression, Sutton decided that was enough reason to stop him. He stepped directly in front of the man, demanded his documents, and made it clear he had the power to ruin his entire day without a single explanation. What Sutton had no idea about was that the man he was speaking to had a badge, a rank, and a legal team that was about to make his name known in every courtroom in the country. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. It was a regular Thursday afternoon in August 2019 when Captain Raymond Shipman, 47 years old, pulled up to the Interior Border Patrol checkpoint on Interstate 19 in southern Arizona. He wasn't on duty. He wasn't chasing a case or following a lead. He was simply a man on personal travel, heading back after a quiet trip, wearing civilian clothes, carrying nothing but a bag and the kind of calm that comes from over 2 decades of doing one of the hardest jobs in America. Shipman had joined law enforcement at 25 years old and had spent 22 years working his way through the ranks of the Tucson Police Department. He hadn't been handed anything. Every promotion, every commendation, every stripe on his sleeve came from years of working difficult neighborhoods, managing high-pressure situations, and earning the respect of the people under his command. By the time he reached the rank of captain, he had supervised hundreds of officers and handled cases that most people never see outside of a documentary. He understood the law not just as a concept, but as something he had lived and enforced every single day of his adult life. On this afternoon, none of that was visible. There was no uniform, no badge clipped to his belt, no patrol car. He was just a black man in his late 40s, traveling alone through a checkpoint in Arizona, and for Agent Craig Sutton, that was apparently enough. Sutton had been stationed at the Interstate 19 checkpoint for 3 years. People who worked alongside him described his style as aggressive, particularly with certain travelers. He had a habit of extending stops beyond what the situation called for, asking questions that had nothing to do with border security, and using his authority as a pressure tool rather than a professional one. Complaints had been filed, supervisors had been made aware, and yet Sutton remained at that checkpoint, waving some cars through in seconds and pulling others into something that felt far less routine. When he saw Shipman's vehicle slow to a stop at the checkpoint lane, something shifted in him. He didn't wave him through. He didn't ask the standard question and move on. Instead, Sutton stepped away from his post and moved directly toward the driver's side window with an energy that had nothing to do with procedure. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. His tone wasn't curious, it was pointed. Shipman answered calmly. He told Sutton where he had been and where he was headed, a straightforward answer to a straightforward question. But Sutton wasn't satisfied. He followed up with another question, then another, each one pushing further than the last. He asked about the purpose of the trip, how long Shipman had been in the area, and whether there was anyone who could verify his story. The questions weren't standard. They were the kind of questions you ask when you've already decided something is wrong and you're just looking for the words to justify it. Shipman stayed composed. He had spent over 2 decades in rooms with people far more aggressive than this, and he knew how to hold himself steady when someone was trying to knock him off balance. But even with all that experience, something about this stop didn't sit right. The tone was off. The length of it was off. The way Sutton was looking at him, scanning him, studying him, felt less like law enforcement and more like something else entirely. What had started as a routine checkpoint stop was quietly becoming something much more serious, and neither man had said the word that was hanging in the air between them yet. But it was coming. What began as an uncomfortable stop at a checkpoint was about to turn into something that would shock every law enforcement professional who heard about it. Sutton wasn't done. In fact, he was just getting started. And the more Captain Shipman held his composure, the more determined Sutton seemed to become. Because for a man like Sutton, calm wasn't reassuring. It was suspicious. Sutton stepped back from the window and radioed for a secondary inspection. He didn't explain why. He didn't cite anything specific that Shipman had said or done. He simply made the call, and within minutes Shipman was being directed to pull his vehicle into the secondary inspection area, a covered bay off to the side of the main checkpoint lanes where vehicles were held for deeper scrutiny. People passing through the main lanes could see it. It was visible, it was public, and it was humiliating in the quiet way that only someone who has never been put in that position could fail to understand. Shipman pulled over as instructed. He was still calm. He stepped out of the vehicle when asked and stood with his hands visible, the way any experienced law enforcement officer would. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't argumentative. He was cooperative in the most complete sense of the word. But cooperation wasn't changing anything about how this was going. It was at this point that Shipman made a decision. He identified himself. He told Sutton clearly and directly that he was a police captain with the Tucson Police Department, that he was off-duty and traveling personally, and that he had his credentials with him. It was a reasonable thing to do. In most situations involving two people in law enforcement, that information would shift the entire tone of the conversation. A mutual recognition would settle in, the tension would drop, things would move forward professionally. That is not what happened. Sutton looked at him and continued as if Shipman hadn't said a word. He didn't ask to see the credentials right away. He didn't radio to verify. He simply kept going, asking more questions, moving around the vehicle, treating the stop like Shipman's identification meant nothing. To the people watching from the main lanes, it looked exactly like what it was. A black man being held at a checkpoint while an agent with a badge and a radio decided how long this was going to take. When Sutton finally did look at the credentials, his response was not what anyone trained in basic professional courtesy would recognize. He handled them slowly, studied them longer than necessary, and then set them aside without the acknowledgement they deserved. There was no "yes, sir," no shift in posture, no recognition of rank. Just more questions, more delays, more of the same pressure wrapped in the same tone. By this point, other agents had drifted into the area. The secondary bay was no longer just Sutton and Shipman. There were eyes on this now, and not one of those agents intervened. Not one of them stepped in to say that a decorated police captain with over 2 decades on the job had identified himself and deserved to be treated accordingly. They watched, and their silence was its own kind of statement. Shipman stood there in the heat of an Arizona afternoon, a 47-year-old man who had given his career to law enforcement, being treated like a person with something to hide. He had answered every question, he had provided his identification, he had remained calm through every minute of it. And still, Sutton kept him there. The detention had now stretched well beyond anything that could be explained by procedure or protocol. This was no longer about border security. It hadn't been about that for a while. What Sutton didn't realize in that moment, standing in that secondary bay, holding the credentials of a man he had decided not to believe, was that everything happening in that covered bay was being noted. The time, the questions, the way those credentials were handled, the silence of the agents who watched and said nothing. All of it was being filed away in the mind of a man who knew exactly what the law looked like when it was followed and exactly what it looked like when it wasn't. Captain Shipman wasn't just standing there. He was remembering everything. There is a moment in every situation like this one where the truth becomes impossible to ignore, where all the authority someone thought they had runs directly into something they cannot explain away or outlast. For Agent Craig Sutton, that moment arrived quietly, but it hit like a wall. A supervisor was called to the secondary bay. Whether it was routine or because someone nearby had grown uncomfortable with how long this was taking, the result was the same. A senior agent walked into that covered bay, looked at the situation in front of him, and asked for Shipman's credentials. He reviewed them carefully, and unlike Sutton, he understood immediately what he was looking at. The man they had been detaining for well over an hour was not a suspect. He was not a person with something to hide. He was a sitting police captain with 22 years on the job, a clean record, and every legal right to be exactly where he was. The supervisor's expression shifted. The energy in that bay shifted with it. Sutton was pulled to the side. The conversation between him and his supervisor was short. It didn't need to be long. The credentials were real, the rank was legitimate, and there was no justification on earth for what had just taken place in that inspection bay. Captain Shipman was free to go, just like that, after all of it. The questions, the delays, the dismissal of his badge, the audience of agents who said nothing. He was simply told he could leave. Shipman collected his credentials, walked back to his vehicle, and drove away from that checkpoint without raising his voice once. He didn't need to, because he already knew something that Sutton was only beginning to understand. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Within days, a formal complaint was filed. Then came the lawyers. Then came the documentation. Every minute of that detention laid out in legal language that left no room for interpretation. What Sutton had dismissed as a routine stop was now a federal civil rights case, and Captain Raymond Shipman, the man he had refused to believe, was the one sitting across the table with the evidence. The federal courthouse was a long way from that dusty inspection bay on Interstate 19, but everything that happened in that bay followed Craig Sutton all the way there. Every question he asked that had no business being asked, every minute he held a man who had already identified himself, every agent who stood in that bay and said nothing. All of it came with a price tag. And the jury was about to decide exactly how much it was worth. The case argued that what happened to Captain Raymond Shipman wasn't a misunderstanding or a procedural error. It was racial profiling, plain and simple. His legal team presented the timeline, the credentials that were dismissed, the length of the detention, and the pattern of behavior that Sutton had been allowed to carry on with for years while supervisors looked the other way. The government tried to frame it as a routine stop that was handled within the boundaries of Border Patrol authority. The jury didn't buy it. The verdict came back at $14.3 million. It was one of the largest settlements of its kind involving a Border Patrol racial profiling case in the country's history. But what that number represented went far beyond Captain Shipman. It was a statement. It said that a badge does not protect you from bias. It said that rank, composure, and cooperation are not always enough when someone has already decided who you are before you open your mouth. And it said that silence, the silence of every agent who stood in that bay and watched, is never truly neutral. Sutton's career did not survive what followed. The department faced serious scrutiny over how complaints against him had been handled and why his behavior had been allowed to continue for as long as it had. The checkpoint on Interstate 19 became a reference point in national conversations about racial profiling within federal law enforcement. As for Captain Raymond Shipman, he didn't walk away from law enforcement bitter. He walked away proven. 22 years of service had given him the tools to handle that afternoon with dignity, and the system, slow and imperfect as it is, had eventually delivered accountability. He was always who he said he was. It just cost $14.3 million to make one man believe it.
Equity is an ongoing path, and information is your greatest armor. We appreciate your viewership and dedication to undeniable truth.